Hello, hi, it's me again. As you can tell from the title, today is all about a new watercolor palette I set up. This will involve quite a bit of swatching, some talk about colors and pigments, but not a lot, and also finally a little painting where I give it a first try. Now, for me personally, setting up a new watercolor palette is really fun. There's just something really satisfying to my brain about picking and choosing particular colors and color combinations, putting them together in a big but still limited collection. Not to mention that swatching paint itself is just really fun. I didn't end up buying anything new for this palette, thank God. I'm trying my hand at a no-buy year in regards to art supplies. But that still left me with a lot of options to choose from because I do own a lot of paint. But yeah, now there is obviously a limit to how many palettes one can reasonably need or store, which is why it's kind of like a special treat for myself whenever I do get to set up one. And coming out of a longer break while trying to reignite my joy for painting seems like the perfect excuse, so let's get into that. There are obviously no rules in how to go about choosing paints for your palette. It all depends on your personal taste and what you want to use the palette for. On my end, I knew I wanted a palette that would inspire me and be a lot of fun to play with, while also giving me the chance to learn something and finally use some colors that I've had lying around for a while but never really got to use much. And with these thoughts in mind, I went through my first round of selections. The focus here in this round was on colors I knew that I definitely wanted to include. So, my first pick on this list is Transparent Yellow PY150. I first saw this yellow while watching somebody else's collection and I fell in love immediately. It's a cool leaning yellow, but it's still kind of middle of the road that, as the name implies, is transparent. It's very vibrant and unlike the cool yellow I already have been using, Lemon Yellow PY3, it has a much darker mass tone, which means it allows for darker mixes when you include this yellow in it. So the next color I knew I wanted to include for sure is this dark red PR179. I am sucker for dark reds, pinks, and purples, and I couldn't resist it when I saw it in the store. I'm really curious to see how it acts and mixes and by itself because similarly to the last color, I didn't get to use it much before because my palettes typically already include a red because I love red. So this is a new experiment. Now, next up is a staple color for me. This is Permanent Rose using the pigment PV19. I love this color and I use it a lot. It's just a classic for me personally. I know a lot of people prefer using Alizarin Crimson as their cool red on palettes, but that just doesn't give me personally the kind of saturated, intense pinks that I like using, and quite frankly, that are part of a lot of my own characters' designs. So I'm staying with PV19. Next one is also a bit unusual for myself because it's an intense purple, but for once it's not Dioxazine Violet PV23, but a color called Brilliant Blue Violet utilizing the pigment PV3. This one is a bit more intense and neon adjacent than PV23, and I'm fairly sure it's not very light fast. Kind of like Opera Pink, it's intense but just doesn't hold up. I don't mind that for this palette because I'm mostly going to play with these in my sketchbooks, which, as we all know, stay closed and out of the sunlight most of the time, so it should be fine. And the next one is called Neutral Tint. I'm trying this out as an alternative to either black, which often takes the vibrancy out of color mixes, or my other go-to, Payne's Gray, which leans a lot more in the cool direction. If you've seen Payne's Grays, they're often kind of bluish in tint, and this one isn't. I bought this one over a year ago, and I really like it in swatches so far, but since it's not on any of my main palettes, I haven't got to use it so far, so this is the chance. This next one is also on practically all of my palettes just because I love it so much. It's in Enthroned Blue PB60. This is a dark but saturated warmish blue. It's absolutely one of those colors you could mix up if you really wanted to, but it's also one of my favorite shades of blue by itself, and it's worth it to me to have it on my palette. It's also, like the other colors in the lineup so far, transparent, which also makes it a lot easier to mix with and handle, and who doesn't like easy? And lastly, on the list of paints that I definitely wanted to include are these 3 granulating paints from Schmincke. I have this frankly a little weird relationship with granulating paints where I absolutely adore them and get seduced into buying them because they just look absolutely delightful. And on the other hand, I have no real clue on how to handle them, which is why I decided to finally include them in this palette specifically. They're here to fill my learning new things quota. I am so excited to play with these more and finally understand how they fit into my own painting habits and style. I tried to go with a variety of different colors so that they wouldn't overlap too heavily, and I'd end up just using one instead of playing with all of the different ones. Beside this list of colors that I knew I wanted to include, I also knew right from the beginning that I wasn't interested in including any earth tones and particularly opaque paints in this palette. There's nothing wrong with those. I have a number of earth tones on my main palette itself. It just doesn't quite fit the vibe that I'm going for here, and I just generally prefer transparent pigments. So, now that we have lined up the must-haves, it's time for the second round of selections. Those were colors I definitely wanted on the palette, and next I went in search for some other colors that I could use to fill up the rest of the palette. The first one here was Undersea Green. It's a granulating green that has this dark and mossy mass tone, but when diluted, it shears out in a way that lets you see some of its component pigments, and it's just so pretty. I also generally just wanted a green on the palette just to round out the color selection a bit, since so far it's a bit heavy on the red, purple, and blue. And next color is actually also one that's on my main palette. It's the Transparent Pyro Orange P071. It's such a delightfully saturated and deep orange. I'm not really into oranges and yellows that much by themselves, but this one just really speaks to me. I don't know, I just love this bad boy. So into the palette it goes. And the final color from this round of selections, Phthalo Blue PB15. It's a staple color and also happens to be my absolute favorite blue right after In Enthroned. It's just so beautiful and vibrant, and even though I could live without it, I would not be happy without it. So, gotta have this bad boy in here as well. And that was the second round of selections. Pretty short, that one. So let's move on to round 3, which is more colors to fill in holes in the current lineup that I was not really sure about. So, first up here is Phthalo Green PG7. Phthalo Green is like the ultimate mixing green. This pigment is in most pre-mixed green colors you can get, and it's insanely versatile. I was considering it for that reason. It really would dramatically increase the color range of the entire palette if I put it on there. Plus, look at it. It is just such a nice emerald shade of green. After Phthalo Green, I also considered Sap Green, which is a convenience green mixed with PG7 and PY153. It's a lovely shade, and I use it quite a bit for mixing on my main palette, and so this was another contender for a green to fill out the palette. Ultimately, I decided against both greens because they just aren't very exciting to me. I have nothing against green, really, but it's also just not very inspiring to me, so I don't mind having very little of it on my palette and just mixing my greens if I do end up needing them for something. So after these, next up to the contenders is Green Gold PY129, which is this gorgeous cool yellow. It's almost greenish in color, but it's really more still on the yellow side. I love it a lot. It's beautiful by itself, and it also mixes really nice skin tones in combination with most any pink color. I did also decide against this one ultimately because I already have a cool yellow, and I know one of them would get neglected in favor of the other, so it felt like a waste to include both. Another yellow I considered was Quinacridone Deep Gold, a warm yellow mix from PY150 and PO48. I really like this one. Similar to the transparent yellow, it becomes kind of bright and saturated if you mix it with a lot of water while still having this dark mass tone. I also ended up scrapping it from the list because I just didn't feel like I needed it after already adding an orange to the palette itself. Again, I knew I would neglect one of these over the other, so it was just easier to, chuck Quinacridone Deep Gold. And I'll be honest, even though it's on this list, this next color was something I only really considered for a short moment, which was Burnt Sienna PR101. I really like it as a color, but pretty early on in the process, I'd already decided that I didn't really care to include earth tones. And now this Burnt Sienna is a lot more of a desaturated orange to me than a true brown. But that's the thing, I already have an orange, so this one never really stood much of a chance. Rip my boy, maybe next time. Next up is a Pyrrole Red PR254, and from what I've been saying for the past few colors, you'd think I'd also scrap this one, because I already have a dark red on this palette, and one could easily mix a strong red with orange and pink, or orange and that dark red. But, you'd be wrong, because I am just a sucker for a good strong red, and I love mixing with it too much to leave it out. What can I say? What can I say, except that these choices are just more about vibes than logical reasons. We're justifying post hoc in this house. And continuing on with the vibes-based choices with this next one, it's another purple, though an unusual one. This is Amethyst Genuine. It's supposedly made from real amethyst, at least partially, and that's pretty cool, but I didn't actually know that when I bought it. I just saw an interesting shade of purple and kind of blacked out, and it was in my cart. It has this subtle glitter effect to it, which is really, really fun, and that's also the reason why I decided to include it on the palette. It's just adding to the fun factor. And finally, we have Prussian Green made from PG7 and PB60. It's this absolutely gorgeous shade of turquoise, and I love using it. I ended up scrapping this one as well, because with the phthalo blue and the Indian Throne already on the palette, I didn't really see that much use for this, especially since I could easily mix something very similar, which is a shame really, but as with the other ones, there's always a next palette that they could make it onto. So since I decided against most of the colors in this third round, I had 2 spots left over, which I decided to fill up with 2 more granulating paints in the end. They were different enough in shade that I didn't feel like they'd overlap too heavily with each other or the other 3 that I'd chosen earlier. And if I was going to commit to using more granulating paints, I might as well jump into the deep end and add another few to the palette. These are respectively a dark blue, leaning purple, and a kind of reserved pink shade. So yeah, this process of elimination took me quite a while, but the ultimate selection got me really excited to paint with. So let's have a look at the final lineup on the palette from left to right. Starting out with Glacier Turquoise, followed by Forest Green, then Undersea Green, Transparent Yellow, Transparent Pyrrole Orange, Pyrrole Red, Dark Red, Permanent Rose, Brilliant Blue Violet, Amethyst Genuine, Neutral Tint, Indian Throne Blue, Phthalo Blue, Deep Sea Violet, Tundra Pink, and Volcano Violet. After making all these hard choices, the only thing left was really to squeeze paints into the palette and finally get to painting. But alas, that ended up being more of a struggle than I planned for, because everything went well until I got to Indian Throne Blue. Apparently, the leftover paint in my tube decided to harden enough that you couldn't really squeeze it out anymore. So I had to get scissors and cut open the tube and scoop out the rest that was in there. I tell you, it was a struggle. Okay, this took way longer than I wanted it to. So now that the palette is all done, let's take that bad boy for a spin and see what painting with it actually feels like. As our guinea pig, I've decided to do a little painting in my sketchbook featuring, of course, none other than one of my own characters. Gotta use my new inspirational palette for its intended purpose, helping me realize very self-indulgent art. As you can see, I like to sketch in colored pencil for my watercolors. This obviously makes it difficult to fix mistakes and erase when it doesn't look the way you want it to, but honestly, I don't mind that. As long as you have a light hand while you're laying down your guidelines and rough sketch, any scribbles will get lost in the layers of paint you add onto it later. Now, for more serious paintings, I still go for a trusty pencil instead of colored ones, just to make sure it actually ends up looking good. But I don't really worry about that so much for quick little fun paintings in my sketchbooks. That's what sketchbooks are for. One definite advantage of colored pencils is that, unlike with softer graphite leads, they don't really smudge even if you use a lot of water on top of them, which is a big plus in my book because I love to start my paintings with a big wash of color. And never mind that it adds a bit of flavor to painting to have the colored lines show through, even through, all the layers you stack on top of those. Anyway, this painting is based off of a quick thing I did back in 2020, I think, or even 2019. A long time ago now, anyway. And then I tried to redraw that a while back, which turned out really badly. I ended up just making the shadows really way too dark, and I hated the final product so much. So I thought I'd give the whole thing another try, since I quite like the original concept. The idea here is that the lighting is coming from behind the character and it gives her this warm glow. I was going for a soft, dreamy sunset kind of look here, which I think we can all agree did not come across in that second version at all. And so I'm taking this opportunity to learn from my previous mistakes and hopefully do better, as you do. But yeah, I started off the painting with a wash of yellow and orange first to create a warm base to work off of later, and then I added some warm purples in for her hair. Her actual hair color is kind of this dark, intense, cool purple, and I was trying to keep that accurate in my older version, and I think that was one of the things that ended up ruining the previous version so much. So I decided to not worry about that this time and just don't think about what the color ought to theoretically be, but just focus on keeping the lighting and vibes correct. It's funny when you're used to, color picking the correct hues for digital art, you can sometimes forget that unfortunately with watercolor or other traditional mediums, you just don't have the option to adjust those colors and the lighting situation after you've already filled everything in. You gotta use your brain from the start, which is both fun, but also sometimes makes me want to pull out my hair. So after that first layer, I really don't have much to say about the process because as you can see, it becomes quite chaotic after that. I just kind of jump around and add some shading here, add some color there, and then move on to the next thing. So there's not a lot of structure or planning going on here, or any, really. Sometimes I even forgot that some parts might still be wet and I ended up having colors bleed where they weren't supposed to go. It was a whole ordeal, but even despite that, I had a really good time. It's obviously too early to make any definitive statements about how well this palette works for me. That'll take a few more paintings at minimum, but it's certainly doing a job at making me want to paint more. On the topic of painting more, even though one of the goals in setting up this palette was to get some more practice with my granulating paints, I ended up using them very, very sparingly in this one. They mostly ended up in multicolor mixtures for some of the shading, as well as some of the darker lines, and of course, somewhere in the hair. But oh well, there's always the next time. Maybe I should look up some advice or tutorials before then though, because I feel so clueless right now. But yeah, even though I, had some struggles, I had some clown moments where I didn't know what I was doing, looking at this painting finished and dry in my sketchbook right now, I feel like it's pretty okay. I could have certainly pushed the rendering a bit more. I went a bit too far in the opposite direction from the last version and left the shadows a little too light and undefined for my personal tastes. That's okay. Sometimes you overcompensate for previous mistakes. That's just how it goes. I didn't expect this to be perfect, and I'm still quite happy with it. It certainly nailed the dreamy aspect of the dreamy sunset look. Now it's very soft, very gentle. But yeah, anyway, if you stuck it out this far, I hope you've had a good time. I had an absolute blast setting up this palette and trying it out for sure. And I'm also always a bit curious, do you have any favorite colors that seem to make their way into every palette and most paintings? I think it's always fascinating to see how different personal tastes can be and which colors speak to different people. I know I wouldn't be happy without my phthalo blue or my permanent rose or my enanthrone blue, really. So I'm curious what other people's, must-have favorites are. Anyway, that is it from me today. I hope you have a good rest of your day, and I'll see you around.